We are pleased to have Professor Freeman from the Department of Church History and Doctrine as our featured House of Learning speaker today. His address is entitled A Legacy of Service, Latter-day Saints in World War II. The library sponsors three main lectures and lecture series: the annual author lecture, the House of Learning lecture series, and the Alice Louise Reynolds Women in Scholarship lecture. Through these lectures, the library brings scholars and students together in a civil discussion of ideas, and in so doing, the library contributes to building a learned community which fosters the faithful life of the mind. The House of Learning lecture series title is taken from the 88th section of the Doctrine and Covenants, verse 119, where the Lord instructs the saints to prepare every needful thing, even a house of learning. Because the library is the campus repository for the literature of all academic disciplines and scholarship, the library is well positioned to be considered BYU's House of Learning. The Harold B. Lee Library takes seriously its campus role as the intellectual heart of inquiry and knowledge, and is pleased to provide this House of Learning lecture today. We wanted to issue a correction to an article that appeared in the Daily Universe yesterday. Our exhibit hours are from 8 to 9, Monday through Saturday, and also the exhibit will run through January 15th, not December 1st, and we hope you'll be able to come to the exhibit. There is a reception following this lecture in the Special Collections area, and so the exhibit will be right there. And I'll be available, as will Professor Freeman, and then also Sean McMurdy, who just gave the prayer, and Mark, and who's our exhibits manager and is largely responsible for what we're seeing, and Mark Poai, who is the conservator for BYU, who's been involved with this exhibit. Mark, could you put your hand up so we can, okay, that's him, can look for him. Now about today's speaker. Professor Robert Freeman, as I've said before, is a professor in church history and doctrine. I asked him what he wanted me to say, and he said, I'm just a teacher. But we know that he's more than that. He and Dennis Wright were the co-founders of the Saints of War Project, which is the genesis of this exhibit today and this lecture. Bob right now serves as the director of the Saints of War Project. We felt like it was a fitting time to talk about to have an exhibit with the 65th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, and we also wanted to mark the change from the Saints at War to things being a part of the library's program. So we'll have Professor Freeman.
Well, I'm grateful to Sean offering the prayer today. I was pleased to see we have a good prayer giver on the program. We'll need it. I'm also thankful for Christy's kind words and for your attendance here today. I'm going to go ahead and kill this little preview that we had up, and I hope you enjoyed. It's, in some sense, just a way of getting more of an invitation out there for you all to come and to see the exhibit. Today, in some sense, is the official opening of it. Before I begin my remarks, I want to take a moment and thank my colleagues and friends, those that have come to support us here today. Certainly that includes the students. You're just awfully important in this process. And I especially extend a thanks for my wife, Janelle, for being able to be with us this afternoon. I suppose more than any other, in terms of the work, in fact, I must say my wife has been a partner to the research and has grown to have a love every bit as much as I do for the veterans that we have worked with. But in terms of the professional day-to-day work, I must take a moment and just thank my dear friend Dennis Wright, who was, as Christy Young rightly observes, co-founder of the Saints at War Research, which is really the story behind the story of how we have moved forward and identified the need to have this exhibit. And my invitation to be with you today to speak is really an extension of the exhibit and what it's about. I specifically thank Christy Young, Sean McMurdy, and Mark Poli, as already has been done, for their extensive work working with me and others to bring this exhibit to pass. And when I speak of students, I just have to give a specific and special plug of thanks for those who have worked as research assistants. As over these last 5 or 6 years, we've accomplished much in the acquisition of accounts of our veteran Latter-day Saints. In all and to date, we have acquired in excess of 2,500 accounts. And I just want to encourage you all that this is where they are, or it is where they are headed. And so come to Special Collections and make use of them and let them touch your hearts, as they have certainly touched mine. Finally, I especially welcome any who may be veterans or family members of veterans who have come this afternoon. You honor us with your presence, and I would just like to take a moment and ask any who may be in that category, veterans, family members, friends of veterans, would you just take a moment and stand, and we would like to acknowledge you. As I welcome the veterans and their families, I also take occasion to apologize in some sense that what we're going to do for the next 30 minutes or so will be very limited in terms of telling actual stories of your veteran family member. You see, with 2,500 veterans to choose from, it's just very limited what we can do in our short time together. And so I've elected to focus in a particular way, and I hope that, that will be understood. Before I begin my focus and really our topic with the legacy of Latter-day Saints service in World War II, I would like to take just a moment and acknowledge the recent anniversary of 9/11 earlier this week, the 5th year anniversary. This nation, indeed this world, has gone through a great deal in the last 5 years. Of course, it's not the first time that wars and rumors of wars have afflicted the present dispensation. I'm grateful, by the way, that the name of this lecture is the House of Learning Lecture. In the Doctrine and Covenants, in section 88, we learned that one of the things that we're to take up is a study of the perplexities of nations and of the wars. And so we do. Anyway, in connection with 9/11, I remember driving home just days after the events, the tragic events of that date. I was tuned to the radio and listening to a commentator who had a guest. It happened that this was a professional from the mental health profession. And the commentator was asking how it was that we, as Americans, were to endure and really to get through the stressful days and weeks that followed 9/11. I found the answer of the guest of the host to be really profound, and I share it with you. He suggested that folks should talk to the generation that had come before, those who had lived through World War II, that they had endured Pearl Harbor and so much in addition in the years that followed, that they could encourage us and teach us lessons of the past. I believe this. I believe that the challenges of our day are great, but I also believe that those who have lived through other difficult times, including World War II, can teach us and inspire us along the way. Veterans that I have worked with from World War II and their families have remembered keenly December 7th, 1941. This summer I interviewed several Latter-day Saints who lived in Hawaii during that time. They remember that infamous day. They remember. Just as my children will long remember September 11th, 2001. The similarities and differences between these 2 days are really rather important. Today I pay tribute to those who gave their lives both on December 7th, 1941 and on September 11th, 2001. Now, I'm grateful for the opportunity of speaking to the important topic of the legacy of Latter-day Saints during World War II. Some have called those who lived through that war the greatest generation. I remember my friend Brother Wright and I interviewing Elder Neil A. Maxwell before his passing. He too was a part of that generation and served in World War II. When we shared that title of the greatest generation with him, he turned it back, saying it was praise too effusive in typical Elder Maxwell form. When we asked then which generation did he think really was the greatest generation, in his typical humility, he complimented the youth of today, saying that he thought that the greatest generation were the youth of our hour, of our time. What a compliment from this beloved apostle. Now, I'm aware that for some, the value of conducting separate research into the experience of Latter-day Saints during war may be very limited. I'm reminded of an interview that my colleague Brother Wright and I had early in our research. It was with a representative of a major newspaper. He was not of the LDS faith. The interview began quite strangely as he conveyed an experience that had happened that morning around his breakfast table. He had shared with his daughter that he was going to interview 2 Latter-day Saint historians about Mormons in World War II. She then queried him as to why it was that Mormons had to tell their own story about the war. He then asked us, "So why do you?" We responded something to the effect that if one were to enter a typical bookstore, he or she might find 100 books on the subject of war. But it was unlikely that even one would deal in any appreciable detail with the religious perspectives on wartime experiences. He agreed that that was true, and then shared that he was Catholic by religion, and that his own father had served in World War II, and that he remembered that there had been important experiences in his father's life where religion had played a role. By the end of our interview, the reporter was convinced that it was actually very appropriate to conduct such research and from this perspective. We must remember that World War II was not just a pivotal part of a decade or of a century, but all of modern recorded history. No war in the history of the world has produced so much bloodshed and devastation than World War II. Over 50 million people died in the awful conflict, and many nations lie in ruin. World War II was a defining moment for humanity. And of course, World War II wasn't really just a war, but it was a combination of wars, the European and Pacific being the largest. One should recall that World War II followed World War I by 20 years. Sometimes called the Great War, World War I was itself a war of great devastation. And the reality is that those who served in World War II were the sons of those who served in World War I. It should be noted at the time of World War II, there were less than 1 million members of the church. Although the majority of Latter-day Saints resided inside the United States, the international presence of the church was increasing. Interestingly, membership of the church in Germany ranked just 3rd behind the United States and Canada at the outbreak of the war. Here you see 2 soldiers from settings other than the United States during the war, Brother Grant Innes from Australia, and Walter Roloff from Germany. For Latter-day Saints, the war began well before Pearl Harbor. The first death of a Latter-day Saint for which we have record occurred just after the German invasion of Poland in September of 1939, possibly around the 10th of that month. I acknowledge here my colleague Roger Meinert, who is doing research into that topic of the Latter-day Saint experience in Germany during the war. Latter-day Saints from other lands were also involved in the fighting from the earliest moments. These soldiers came from such places as Britain, Europe, Canada, and as we've mentioned, even Australia. Forgive me. Latter-day Saints served with distinction in the military. Several of those who became future general authorities of the church were included. You see here pictured President Boyd K. Packer. I'll mention more about him in a moment. Elder L. Tom Perry, after whom the L. Tom Perry Special Collections is named, and Elder David B. Haight. While wartime estimates of the church participation in the war have that by the end of the war, over 100,000 Latter-day Saints were in uniform, and that in 1945. We see some sights and sounds of the war and its participation just in the pre-hour block of images from the Special Collections, forgive me. We had a picture of President Packer and his Book of Mormon from the time of the war. Notice that it's leather bound, his own stitching, as he added a serviceman's jacket leather casing to a book that was depleting. And you can see his heavy marks of indicative of his careful study of this scripture. Well, the church issued these Book of Mormons to Latter-day Saints throughout the service and during the war as a way of keeping the scriptures close to them, and it was a pocket-size edition so that they could have ready access to the contents. Many of the veterans that we have worked with have been able to produce those Book of Mormons that they kept long after the war. We've identified already the church position and setting during the war in terms of membership and international emergence. One way that the church sought to support the Latter-day Saints was with the inauguration of the Servicemen's Committee. And one of the purposes that they had was to organize groups of Latter-day Saints so that they could have, where possible, opportunities to worship together. And where numbers were sufficient, occasionally were convened servicemen's conferences. We see here several examples of settings in which such conferences were convened. Places like Guam, Okinawa, India, and Italy. Veterans we've talked to counted such opportunities to meet with other Latter-day Saints among the very most important experiences of their lives. Here we see a little base chapel where Latter-day Saints also could gather. During the war, the church was a part of the organization of chaplains. In all, approximately 45 chaplains were called during the war, and they had a great commission. Here you see pictured several of these brethren, and in the foreground is Brother Eldon Ricks. He made a career here at Brigham Young University, and pleased to have him sharing his accounts with us, and his notes are included in our exhibit. I only stop at this picture a little longer to indicate that on the windshield you'll see several interesting images. We have the typical crosses of a chaplain's jeep, but we also have other images, and I want to draw your attention to them. During the war, our Latter-day Saint chaplains had great difficulty in identifying who were the Latter-day Saints that they were serving, as it was very difficult to perceive them from the rest of the crowd. So this particularly creative group of chaplains determined that they would add a little decoration to their jeep. So you see a beehive, an angel Moroni, and the word Deseret. As they would pass by soldiers, as they would see those indications, they knew there was something different about that group. And so they would stop them, and an acquaintance was made and an opportunity to minister. I'm going to move a few of these up along quite quickly, but I just have to stop at this one. I added it as an image of, I hope, relevance to the students who are here today. During World War II, very interesting the look of the BYU campus. You see the membership of the community of the campus declined appreciably during the war years. From 2,300 at the beginning of the war in Europe to the 1943 mark, we see a decline to 800, nearly 900 students. A number of events were canceled, and the thing that I wanted to draw your attention to is that the ratio of men to women during that time turned out to be 6-1. Just as a little trivia note, and I have to add 2 or 3 of these, I just have to include this ship, this picture of the Joseph Smith, a Liberty-class ship. It was commissioned in 1942, and then a second ship named after another of the Latter-day Prophets, the Brigham Young, was commissioned in 1943. And these are very curious. People look at them with wonder. How is it that the prophet's name appears on such a big ship? However, I must tell you as an aside, veterans I've visited with who actually were ever on a Liberty ship are clear in saying that it really wasn't a lot of fun to be on a Liberty ship. So they were a little like sardines packed together. Again, we see some examples of the church outreach as they worked hard to have materials in the hands of our Latter-day Saint young men. You see pictured several publications, and I have just one example with me. This happens to be the Church News Serviceman's Edition. Again, pocket size, so it's very able to be taken into the field. And we've had several Latter-day Saint veterans who commented that after they would read their edition of the Church News, they'd pass it along to a buddy, typically not a member of our faith. They were so glad to have something from home to read, they would read the Church News. So good purposes in distributing that particular publication. Well, we've made the comment already that membership of the church in Germany ranked just third behind the United States. And this is one reason, at least, why we distinguish our research and the exhibit and what we've conducted here from other works, say Tom Brokaw's Greatest Generation, because we really were on both sides of the war, and we had this sense of brother against brother, and there were sensitivities about that. So you see some of the statistics relating to the German experience during the war, including the fact that by the end of the war, 85% of our members in Germany were left homeless. Well, when I asked Christy Young what this lecture should be about, she said, let's be sure that it includes stories. And so, in deference to her, and because I think most of us appreciate the insights gathered from the human impact stories, I've elected to tell just several according to time and as it permits. And the first that I would like to just mention is that of Brother Doug Cahoon. He was newly married as he headed off to the war, and as he did so, he had, of course, the longings for home, and yet the optimism that he would return. It's interesting that we have several pieces of correspondence between Brother Doug Cahoon and his wife, and as we've read through those, they tell a very intriguing story, a poignant story, as these letters so often do. I might just mention parenthetically, we're so grateful to have at Special Collections the personal letters of such wonderful people as Elder and Sister Theodore Tuttle. And these are poignant letters. I have read them, very touching. I'm reminded of an account in President Faust's biography where he talks about his service during World War II and how it was that he wrote every day of the war to his beloved Ruth. And on one occasion, she received quite a bundle of mail. See, they would write every day, but the delivery was much more sporadic. So on one occasion, Sister Ruth Faust received notice at her work that 90 letters had arrived at home. Her employer gave her the rest of the afternoon off so she could return home and digest the contents of those touching letters. So we're grateful for the Tuttles and their sharing as we are with the Cahoons. In any case, Brother Doug Cahoon, as you can see, was blessed with a talent of art. And in the exhibit here, we have several of the pieces that he created. Sadly, he did not return home from the war. And in the last piece of correspondence to his beloved Rhoda back home, he provides a very interesting perspective. He writes, "I miss you so much, but I know this isn't going to get me home any sooner. So I'm just waiting and loving you each day. Good night, Angel. Forever yours, Doug." Poignant, isn't it? As he did not return to his home. I'd like to tell of another Latter-day Saint who paid the ultimate price, and in doing so, set the context for the entrance of the United States into World War II. Last Sunday, many of us were present in the Marriott Center, or in other ways had access to the proceedings, where President Monson made mention of one brother, Mervyn Benyon. And I appreciated so much his doing that, and I want to just share a little more about his story. On the occasion of December 7th, Mervyn Benyon was serving as captain of the USS West Virginia, affectionately known as the Weevee, a battleship docked there in Pearl Harbor. We picture him in our mind's eye preparing for church. He's going into Honolulu to attend worship services. He had been with the mission president and his wife the previous evening, but had elected to return to his ship and be with his men. In any case, as he was completing his preparations, a sailor on watch on the bridge nearby dashed in to report that they were under attack. Immediately, Captain Benyon called all men to their battle stations. Shortly after, 3 Japanese planes, torpedo planes, flew near the West Virginia and struck in rapid succession. Several of the planes dropped bombs directly over the ship. When the first wave of planes had completed their run, Captain Benyon stepped out onto the conning tower to assess the damage. While doing so, he was hit with a piece of shrapnel from the adjoining ship, the USS Tennessee. It cut him to the ground. He fell and very quickly realized that he was severely hit. And later that morning, he would die there on the deck of the USS West Virginia. Still, for the duration of the bombing, Captain Benyon remained conscious and quietly maintained command of the ship, giving direction and advice with little regard for his own life, but for the purpose of only saving the crew and his ship. After various attempts to save the captain's life were found to be in vain, the captain counseled them to leave him and to save their own lives. He died soon after that. For his bravery and courage, Captain Benyon was awarded the Medal of Honor, our country's highest honor, posthumously. We see here not only pictured that medal, but also copies of his personal scriptures and of the volume, Jesus the Christ. While damaged, you see that they are still usable, and we are very proud to have in this exhibit both his scriptures, articles of faith, Jesus the Christ, I think, and the Medal of Honor. I'd like to tell of another family. It was not uncommon for families of Latter-day Saints to lose more than one son in the war. One poignant example of such loss was that of the Borgstrom family in Garland County, Utah, who lost 4 sons in the space of 6 months. President Monson told their poignant story in a general conference address in 1999. I would like to just share a portion of it with you. He refers to a special memorial service that was held immediately after the war, where General Mark Clark attended, representing the United States government, and where President George Albert Smith was also present. President Monson quotes from an account by General Clark. It says, General Clark, I flew to Garland the morning of June 26th, met with the family, including among others the mother, father, and 2 remaining sons, one lad in his teens. I had never met a more stoic family group. As the 4 flag-draped coffins were lined up in front of us, and as I sat by these brave parents, I was deeply impressed by their understanding, by their faith, and by their pride in these magnificent sons who had made the supreme sacrifice. During the luncheon period that followed, Mrs. Borgstrom turned to me and said in a low voice, "Are you going to take my youngest one?" I answered in a whisper that as long as I remained in command of the army in the West Coast, if her boy were called, I would do my best to have him assigned to duty at home. In the middle of this whispered conversation with the mother, the father suddenly leaned over and said to Mrs. Borgstrom, "Mother, I have heard your conversation with the general about our youngest. We know that if our country needs him, he will go." Concludes General Clark, I could hardly contain my emotions. Here were parents of 4 sons lying dead from wounds received at battle, and yet they were ready to make the last sacrifice if their country required it. The Mervyn Benyon and Borgstrom boys' stories, our sons, are only the beginning of a long list of Latter-day Saints who returned with honor, but not to an earthly home, during the war. The war took many of our best young Latter-day Saints, some 5,000 in all. Recently, I was a part of an event where Boyd and Lloyd Lewis from Cache Valley, Utah, were honored for service they rendered during World War II. In the case of the latter, he was honored posthumously. Their story is unusual and tragic for several reasons. Here we see them pictured. Lloyd and Boyd, through their youth, were virtually inseparable. These identical twins were of the kind that they could literally perceive each other's thoughts. They shared everything together. When the war broke out and they entered the service, they insisted they must serve together, and the military relented. Their experience took them to some of the most awful fighting in the Pacific. In the moment that I will detail, we see the two of them in the terrible fighting at Iwo Jima. We should all remember Iwo Jima. That is the place where in February of 1945, the famed picture was taken of an American flag carried to the top of Mount Suribachi. By the way, you may be interested to know that flag was secured by none other than a Latter-day Saint by the name of A. Theodore Ted Tuttle, a young Marine and a future general authority of the church. We are so grateful to have the story of the Elder Tuttle in our exhibit. In any case, the two Lewis brothers were engaged in the fighting on that island, and much of the remainder of the story of the incident that took place, of which I'm referring, I will take from Brother Lloyd Lewis's own words. One morning on a particularly violent day of fighting, Boyd turned to his twin brother, Lloyd, and indicated that he was going to die. Said, "Boyd, I'm going to leave you." Lloyd responded, "What do you mean you're going to leave me?" Boyd calmly proclaimed, "I'm going to die." Lloyd thought that his brother was just catching cold, and maybe something had gotten into his mind. The day went on, and as evening approached, Lloyd remembers what happened next. It was about 5 o'clock in the evening. We'd fought all day. We were there sitting kind of in this hole, but there was a little piece of dirt between us. Our arms were overlapping, and just then 2 mortars, Whistling Willies as they were known, came toward us with great velocity. They were bound for a direct hit. Recalls Lloyd, we folded up our arms to cover our eyes. And the next thing I knew, I was airborne, and then on the ground. I couldn't imagine what had happened. Lloyd immediately tried to locate his brother as he regained his bearings. He cleared his own eyes and began to focus on a soldier's helmet nearby. In the helmet was a face that mirrored his own. Dog tags that, but for one letter, matched his own. I won't detail the scene, brothers and sisters, only to say that Lloyd Lewis gathered up his brother in his poncho. Lloyd recalls, "I knew that I had to take care of him, so I gathered him up and got permission to take him back to the hospital." At the field hospital, a doctor asked Lloyd what he needed. The only words he could get out were, "I've got my brother." A tired doctor called out, "Now look here, we're busy. What have you got there?" Lloyd dumped the poncho on the ground. "Here's my brother." He asked for water to clean his twins' remains, and then permission to take his brother's body to the cemetery for burial. There on Iwo Jima, under the glow of gunfire, Lloyd Lewis dug a grave for his brother. For years after the war, Lloyd was tortured by the loss of his brother. Several years ago, we convened a special conference here at BYU to pay tribute to our veterans. Brother Lewis attended. I can tell you it was a very emotional experience for me to meet this hero in my life. As we move to conclusion, I want to share just one story of international interest and involving one of our saints from Canada. I guess I do this in part out of deference to my good friend Brother Ride, bring the international component, the Canadian element in. And it's a little bit of a happier story, and we all need that. It comes from the life of Brother Ken Schubert. Ken was the member of a Canadian RAF crew when his plane was shot down over Belgium during the war. He was fortunate to parachute to safety, though his captain laid down his life for his friends. Upon landing in the field of a Belgian farmer, he was rescued from his awful circumstance. The farmer took him into his home, and this family actually gave him refuge, even at their own peril. I want to quote this story from Brother Schubert's own words. To evade the Gestapo, I often hid in the attic, where I sat and unstitched my parachute and life jacket. One day I was in the backyard, and I heard the mother and father excitedly speaking in loud tones in the front of the house. I immediately headed for the field to hide, as I could not make it to the attic. I realized that there was a wide open area, and no hiding place could be found. So I immediately entered a goat's shed, a small 6-by-7-foot square room in the work shed, where I squeezed myself into the corner. The door opened, and a big black boot came through. The goat lunged on her chain, and the boot withdrew. When I had entered, the goat had remained quiet, although she had never been a great friend of mine. Since then, I hold all goats in high esteem, as she no doubt saved me and my adopted family from the Gestapo. Well, I appreciate Brother Schubert and his memory. We need to remember that the war, as awful as it was, provided the context for the introduction of the gospel into new lands. Places like Guam, the Philippines, Spain, and others actually had their beginnings during the war. Even President Packer, we referred to earlier, had a role in new beginnings of the church in Japan, as he was involved in the baptism of the Sato family immediately after the war, the very first baptisms in Japan following the conflict. Here you see a picture of a convert baptism in Saipan during the war. President Hinckley has called such events silver threads in the midst of war. The war raged on for nearly 6 years before it concluded. The European War raged on for nearly 6 years before it finally concluded in May of 1945. And of course, the end of the war in Europe was not the end of all hostilities. The war in the Pacific continued for another several months before finally ending in August of the same year, as the Japanese surrendered after the dropping of the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And following the conclusion of the war, the church soon found itself in the more customary role of assisting its members and others in recovery from the terrible events. One of the inspiring elements of veterans for me is that they were able to come home and resume life. These men came home, and while very often battered and scarred, they went on to become our scoutmasters, our shop owners, our church and community leaders, as my companion Brother Wright has acknowledged. They raised families and in most ways experienced mortal life like the rest of us. Still in the recesses of their memories, their story is distinct from the rest of us. For their legacy is their service in World War II. I would like to close on a personal observation of war. It is that war is ruthless, and it is cruel. It is Satan's tool, and it is so hard on the children. In the context of present wars, President Hinckley said while speaking on this campus in March of 2003, in such times of war, we feel the great inequality of sacrifice when men and women are called to active duty in behalf of their country. May those of us who are spared such sacrifice never be proud or arrogant, but rather humbly grateful for those who lay down their lives in times of war. These, a few of God's choicest, left a legacy for all of us. I think something of the legacy of those of World War II is captured in a message that greets visitors to one of the Allied cemeteries in Europe. With a simple placard, it reads, "For your tomorrow, we gave our today." With you, I pay tribute to these men of valor. With you, I look forward to the day when, as proclaimed in the 46th Psalms, the Lord will fully and finally maketh wars to cease in the end of the earth. Thank you.